Number 6. A Plum-Pudding by Sabine Baring-Gould. As far as man could suppose, every element that goes to make up happiness was united to bless Mr. and Mrs. Birdwood. He was in easy circumstances, that is to say, he had earned enough money not to be obliged to work any longer, and had his own little house and could keep a slavey. He was inoffensive in his pursuits, being fond of flowers, especially of roses, which he grafted. And what harm can there be in a man who loves gardening? Next to marrying a curate, a woman has a good certainty of her husband turning out amiable and orderly if he grafts roses. Then again, he was in the prime of life, by no means bad-looking, amiable, and placid. You could not study his face and not see that he was good-natured. On the other hand, Mrs. Birdwood was comely, a lively woman, neat in shape, under 30, and of a florid complexion, which ought to suit a man addicted to flowers. She had made a good match, said her friends, for she was one of 14, and had come penniless to his arms. She had been Eliza Gubbins, and had dropped the Gubbins at the altar. No one could deny that she was the gainer when she acquired a name that carried with it a suggestion of piping and tooting and whistling and jug-jugging and cooing of all kinds of songbirds. But there is a fly in every cup, a thorn to every rose, some bone in every joint you get from the butcher, a cloud in every sky. Mr. Birdwood was of an over-placid and too easy-going nature to satisfy Mrs. Birdwood, who was impulsive, exacting, and sanguine. He accepted connubial felicity as he did his meals, as something anticipated, necessary, and ordinary. Instead of exhibiting an effusion of gratitude to his wife for making him happy, he budded his roses and divided his bulbs and potted his tubers as though that were the main object of his life, instead of falling down and admiring that luminous transcendental being who had condescended to come into Jessamine Villa to be his happiness. They had been married a 12-month, rather more. Eliza Gubbins had supposed that an enamored swain, after marriage, would grow in love like a conflagration, which increases as you add fuel. But it was not so. He was warm and approving, but never rose above blood heat. Moreover, he had a provoking Christian name, Josiah, that he could not alter. Eliza had fed on poetry and romance in her maiden days, and the name Josiah had in it nothing poetical, no romance. "I can't call you Joss," she said, "for that is the short for Joseph or Joshua." "Well, then call me Ziah." "Sire." "No, thank you. It would seem as though I regarded you as my sovereign." As yet there was no child, nor prospect of one. This fact might have been considered a reason why they should have been more than ever devoted to one another, as there was no distraction, no one else in the house to love except the slavey, and she was naturally out of the question. But it was not so. Mrs. Birdwood had nothing else to think about except the lack of ardor in Mr. Birdwood, and nothing else to do but fret over it. "My dear," said Josiah Birdwood one day at table, "my dear, I think Maggie Finch is just about your size and build." "Maggie Finch? And who is she?" "I mean the girl at Miss Thomas's, the dressmaker's." "Maggie Finch, indeed!" exclaimed Eliza, turning first red, then white. "And pray, what do you know about that?" witheringly. "Maggie Finch." "Oh, nothing, my dear, only she is in Miss Thomas's shop." "And what do you know of Miss Thomas's shop?" "Why not, my dear? You go to Mr. Gardner's, Mr. Gardner the tailor, I mean." "Oh, of course I do. I have tailor-made dresses." "Then why should not I go to the milliner's to have a milliner-made suit?" "It is preposterous. Maggie Finch, indeed. How do you know she is a Maggie?" "Miss Thomas calls her so." "Besides—" "Well?" sternly eyeing him. "I got her the situation." "Oh, I see. You got her the situation. Yes, her poor father—" "I want to hear nothing of the poor father. It is poor Maggie you think of. I see all, clear as daylight. A Finch and a Birdwood match much better than a Gubbin and a Birdwood." And then she burst into tears. "My dear, be reasonable, and kindly give me a spoonful of gravy. My bacon is dry." "How can you? How can you? Heartless, cruel man! Oh, that I had married a commercial traveler." "A bagman, my dear?" "You need not open your mouth, nostrils, and eyes with such a snorting affectation of surprise. I said it, a commercial traveler." "I did not know, my dear." No, you did not know that I had a tender corner in my heart, a general predilection for commercials. They go about in flights like hummingbirds in the Brazilian forests. Have you been in Brazil, dear? No, I have not, but I have read of them. Living, animated jewels they are. Which, the bagmen or the hummingbirds? I won't speak to you any more. You purposely misunderstand me to insult me, that you may go off to your Maggie Finch's. There is only one, dear, and so much the worse. You focus, you concentrate on that wretched object, the admiration, the love of which I am bereaved. If you go gallivanting and meandering round dressmakers' assistants, I can do the same. I will not be left out in the cold for any Maggie Finches, I can tell you. There are plenty of bagmen, as you call them, commercials in their proper designation, who would be only too glad, too proud, to lick the dust off my feet. My dear, you are hot. Well, I have occasion to be hot. And my tea is cold. This is an outrage. Mrs. Birdwood rose and flounced out of the room. She rushed upstairs, casting at the slavey en passant a notice to quit, for no particular reason, but as a vent to her wrath, and she dashed into the bedroom, where nothing had as yet been put in order, and threw herself in the armchair and burst into a flood of tears. She remained for some time crying and fanning herself into a greater flame of wrath. Then she rose and went to the window. She saw her husband. He had taken off his coat, and he was digging in the garden. He had told her the previous evening that he expected hard frost, and would turn up the mold that the slugs might be killed. Actually, after that scene, after those reproaches hurled at him, after that exposure, he was placidly digging that the frost might kill the slugs. Really, the man was unendurable. About an hour later, he drew on his coat and came in, and brushed down his trousers and washed his hands. Mrs. Birdwood lurked about, watching. He went out at the front door, passed into the street, and disappeared. Mrs. Birdwood drew on her cloak, adjusted a hat, and followed. She had hardly reached the gate before she saw Josiah turn in at a door to a shop some way up the street, over which was inscribed, Thomas, Milliner and Dressmaker. The die is cast, flaunting his vices in the face of his wife. I, too, can be vicious. If he goes hunting dressmakers, why, even I can seek commercial travelers. She set her lips, her eyes glared, her face was terrible in its wrath. She hastened to retrace her steps, gathered together a few of her most valued and necessary goods, and left the house. There, she said, slamming the iron gate after her, there, two can play at this game. If he deserts me, I also can desert him. Good-bye to Jessamine Villa. Oh, that I had married a commercial. She took her way to the station. Let me see, said she. I'll go a-junketing to the seaside and enjoy myself. Happily, I have money. He gave me enough to pay the monthly bills. Won't he be surprised when he comes back from Finching to find me flown? Yes, I'll go to Sandbourne and enjoy the sea breezes, and pick up shells and seaweeds, and look at the visitors, and perhaps a commercial or two may flit past my admiring eyes. Their manners are so elegant, they have such persuasive ways, their address is so engaging. Furnished with a ticket, she got into a second-class carriage. She was about to enjoy herself, so she would not go third, and she had money to spend. There was a gentleman in the carriage. He had been seeing a number of large black boxes put into the luggage van. He took his seat after Mrs. Birdwood had ensconced herself in a corner, hoping to have a carriage to herself. Off went the train. As already said, Mrs. Birdwood was a comely woman, and this the other traveller perceived, and was unable to take his eyes off her. If a cat may look at a king, then surely a commercial may gaze on a pretty woman. Mrs. Birdwood did not like it, and put up her hand to let down her veil. Unhappily, in her hurry at leaving, she had forgotten her veil. "Christmas coming soon," said the gentleman, "a time of holly and mince pies, and above all of mistletoe. I think I know someone who would like to be under mistletoe bush with somebody else, unnamed." "And I think," said Mrs. Birdwood, "I know someone who would like to have a bunch of holly with which to whack into somebody else, unnamed." "Going any distance, miss?" asked the bagman. "I don't quite know where I am going," inadvertently replied the runaway wife. Then she bit her tongue in vexation at having said what she had. "Let me recommend Sanborn," said he confidingly. "A charming place, beautiful beach. Excuse me, I think the ticket you hold. Ah, it is for Sanborn. How happy a coincidence! I am going there as well. If I can be of any assistance with your luggage, command me." "I have none." "Indeed! Going to friends?" She was silent. Tears came into her eyes, tears of mortification and anger. "My dear young lady," said the fellow passenger, "I trust I have not touched on any tender point. When lovely woman stoops to conquer, especially with tears as her weapons, she is irresistible." "Really, sir," exclaimed Mrs. Birdwood, "I must request you to desist from these impertinences and this odious familiarity." "1,000 pardons. I am mute." On reaching Sanborn Station, Mrs. Birdwood dismounted from the train, greatly relieved to be able to shake off the gentleman who had annoyed her. She sought out a modest inn, and then walked down to the shore. "A pretty pass Josiah will be in," thought she, "when he finds that I am gone. There will be ructions in the house. Well, if he will run after Finches, he must take the consequences. And Christmas coming on as well, and no comforts, no plum-pudding. I'll be bound that Jemima will serve up the roast beef without any horseradish. Serve him right. And as to Yorkshire pudding, she can't make it. Very glad. He'll suffer where most sensitive. Oh!" She saw a large colored poster. "A circus! I have not seen one since I was a girl. I will go." But she did not enjoy herself at the horsemanship. Her mind reverted to Jessamine Villa, and to a plum-pudding she had made a month ago, and had put away in a tin to be ready for Christmas. She wished she had brought it with her, but she had left it behind, locked up. Her husband knew nothing about it. The slavey was equally ignorant. Now that costly and excellent plum-pudding would be lost, for she would never go back to Jessamine Villa, never, never within the sound of the name of Finch. That plum-pudding had been made from an excellent recipe given her by her mother. 5 pounds suet, 4 pound flour, 3 pound breadcrumbs, 4½ pound raisins, 3 pound currants, 1½ pound sugar, 1 pound mixed peel, 1 pint old ale, 1 nutmeg, 6 teaspoonfuls salt, 2 quarts milk, 12 eggs, boiled 8 hours, a sufficient quantity for 9 puddings, 4 of which are large. She could rehearse it by heart. Of course, in the small establishment at Jessamine Villa, 9 puddings, 4 of which were large, were not required. But the late Mrs. Gubbins had been a woman with a large family and a larger heart, and she had been accustomed to send puddings to her married sons and daughters. Mrs. Birdwood had halved everything, and then had been able to give a pudding to an aunt at Bandon, another she had sent to a married brother in London, a small one she had reserved for a poor old woman who received her charities, and the rest were for Jessamine Villa consumption. And now— "Dear, dear, dear," sighed Mrs. Birdwood, not observing anything in the arena. "I beg pardon, did you mean me?" asked a voice. She turned and saw the commercial traveller beside her. "No, sir," she retorted sharply. "I alluded to the pudding. With raisins at 5 pence and only 9 eggs a shilling, it is dear, very dear, inexpressibly dear." "I beg pardon again. I don't quite take it in. The pudding was not for your consumption, sir." "You would confer on me, miss, a great favor, if you would give me your name. 1,000 apologies for asking." "My name is—" She choked. Should she give her married or her maiden name? Never mind. "And mine is Fisher. I am in the hosiery and haberdashery business. That is to say, I travel for a firm in that line. I am now staying at the Woolpack." "At the Woolpack? Well, so am I," she cried in dismay. "This will never do. No, never." She dashed out of the circus, went to the inn, removed her trifling effects, paid her bill, and departed to the Red Lion. Next morning she came down to the coffee-room, and was dismayed to find there Mr. Fisher. "Good gracious me!" she exclaimed. "I thought you were at the Woolpack." "So I was, but as it seemed to offend you, and I could not think of annoying a lady, I went back when the performance was over, paid my account, and departed to another inn, the Red Lion." "This will never do," gasped Mrs. Birdwood. "I shall leave immediately." She hastened to the station and took the train for Bandon. She would go to her aunt. The plum-pudding had preceded her. If she followed, it was but like a player of bowls, who delivers his ball and then runs after it. Her aunt was pleased to see her, and asked what occasioned this visit. Mrs. Birdwood made the excuse that she wished to see her before Christmas, and that she had friends in Bandon she also desired to see. She had not visited them since her— she gulped— her marriage. "I dare say, auntie, I may remain here a few days." "Delighted, my dear, to see you. But you do not intend to remain long, because Christmas is at hand, the day after tomorrow, and of course you will be back for that." Mrs. Birdwood looked down and did not answer. Next morning she went to see friends. About midday she returned, when she was encountered by her aunt in the passage. "My dear, dreadful news. Have you heard?" "Heard? No. What?" "It comes from Jemima's mother, your maid of all work, as you took from here at my recommendation. She writ to her mother yesterday evening, and it is shocking, awful." "What is it, aunt?" Mrs. Birdwood turned white. That slavey had written her that her mistress had run away, and doubtless with amplifications of her own, run away with a commercial in the hosiery and haberdashery line, and had been seen with him at a circus at Sanborn. "You must prepare yourself for the worst," said the aunt. "I know it," gasped Mrs. Birdwood. "I don't see how you can, as it only happened yesterday," said the old lady. "Well, tell me all. Hold back nothing." "Your dear Josiah. He's gone and scalded hisself to death in trying to bile a plum-pudding for his Christmas dinner. The flesh has come off in collops, just like an overboiled leg of veal, with rice, you know. Don't cling to the bone. I had a rabbit, too, once." Mrs. Birdwood uttered a cry. She did not stay to hear about the rabbit, but flew to the station. She was just in time to catch a train. She took her ticket she asked for one to Jessamine Villa, but the clerk said there was no such station. Then she recalled the name of the town, in the outskirts of which Jessamine Villa was situated. Weeping, trembling, sick at heart, she sat in the third-class carriage as she was whirled home, to the home she had left, to the husband she had deserted. On reaching the station where she had to disembark, she flew to the villa. From a distance she could see the blinds were drawn down, but then it was evening, and a lamp was alight within. Was it where he was laid out in his bones? She burst in at the door, bathed in a dew of anguish as well as heat, rushed into the sitting-room, and found there Mr. Birdwood in an armchair by the fire, his foot up, reading a catalogue of horticultural structures. "Well, my dear," said he, "back again?" "And you have not been scalded?" "Yes, my foot." "How?" "Jemima said she couldn't make a Christmas plum-pudding, and I said we must have one, so I tried my hand." "But the flesh, has it left the bone in collops?" "No, I am blistered, that is all. I spilt the mess over my foot. It was not quite on the boil, I believe." "Goodness me! And how did you make the mess?" "Well, all right. Raisins and flour." "No suet?" "No." "No mixed peel?" "Never thought of it." "Any old ale?" "Well, of course not." "Nor eggs?" "Did not suppose they were wanted." "Then," said Mrs. Birdwood, "it was a mess. I'm glad it was all spilt." She heaved a sigh. "Oh, Josiah, how could you?" "I did my level best," he replied. "Now look here. Do you see that parcel? Open it. It is a silk gown, my Christmas present to you, all ready for you to wear to church tomorrow. It was fitted on Maggie Finch, as she is your size and shape." With trembling fingers, Mrs. Birdwood opened the parcel and drew forth a really gorgeous silk dress. "Oh," she said, "and that Finch! She served as dummy on which to fit it, you know. And that was all that took you to Miss Thomas's?" "What more do you want? Not an evening dress also, low-breasted and shoulder-straps?" Oh, Josiah, I have been so wicked. I but never mind what I thought. I intended to run away and desert you. Fancy, forever. Pshaw, you couldn't do it. And to take up with a commercial. My dear, you couldn't do it. And his name is Fisher. Not a hummingbird, but a kingfisher, I suppose. But in the hosiery and haberdashery line, you couldn't do it. "I really believe you are right," said Mrs. Birdwood, throwing herself on his neck and bursting into tears. "There, dear, that will suffice," said Josiah. "And," asked his wife, "what did you think when I disappeared?" "I didn't think anything about it. I knew it was all right." "And what have you been doing without me?" "Well, I've been trying to make up my mind whether to have a span or a lean-to conservatory." "You are positively incorrigible." "Then I tried my hand on the plum-pudding and failed. So now we shall have to do without." "No, 10,000 times no," replied Mrs. Birdwood triumphantly. She went to a corner cupboard, unlocked it, produced a tin, took off the lid. Here is a real plum-pudding for our happy Christmas dinner." "And," said Mr. Birdwood, "I bought a sprig of mistletoe at the door." and will kiss you under it.